10 years have passed since Arkham Knight's release, and it looks like finally some toy companies are starting to pay attention to this portrayal of Batman in action figure form. And since the release of the Rocksteady sequel, we only really got one extremity or the other, the very budget-friendly McFarlane Toys version in 7-inch format, or the 1/6 scale, much pricier, very high caliber, high quality, high consumer version from Hot Toys. And before we get to what could be one of the more definitive versions in the LPZZ interpretation, just right around the corner, let's first tackle yet another prosumer company that made their much more stylized take on the character. First of all, I'll give Amazing Yamaguchi or Revoltech or whatever name they kind of go by, Kyoto, whatever the parent company is, their credit as far as actually nailing the color scheming and the representation of the Arkham Knight suit from Arkham Knight. I would say they got the color scheming right as far as the Arkham Knight panelized, very armorized version with an awful lot of the gray, the silver, the chrome, a few accents of the, I almost want to say copper. It's not so much like a straight up gold, but more so like a goldish copper sort of aesthetic to the utility belt that is super gadgetized right there in the middle. But then to me, what really makes it speak Arkham Knight as opposed to the other versions of the Rocksteady trilogy, at least the specific trilogy, would have to be just how armorized his new, very tech-driven suit really is. But then on top of that, the color scheming that is kind of connecting everything together as far as the silver, the jet black, and a little bit of that sheen and armorized paneling to the armor around the shoulder guard area, the torso, and then those cushiony pads that are kind of encompassing the majority of his biceps, thighs, that are now boasting like this lightish, grayish blue. It's definitely a tint of blue, but it's kind of angling itself a little bit towards being a bit of a grayish blue, and they managed to nail that color scheme because it's kind of difficult to make sure that the shaders are coming across very well, at least especially when you're holding this figure in person. And I can testify that they managed to get the color scheming almost one-to-one accurate when it comes to those pads right there that you see on the thighs, the biceps, and how they really complement the rest of the very, like I said, armorized, tactile feel of the shoulder guards. And especially the detail, the way that they were able to chisel out the little gadgetry, the rivets and bolts and the things that just feel so mechanized and almost movable within the gauntlets and the boots. They nailed that. To the point where you can even see, without spoiling a little bit of the articulation, that some said panels actually do in fact move, specifically the ones that are kind of encompassing the front of his ankle right here. Some of those panels do in fact have a little bit of mobility to them. Not much to really be found within the gauntlets. There's a part of me that almost kind of wishes that the spikes that make up the little spiky pieces of the gauntlets that Batman is known for to be able to move, but they are in fact painted and sculpted very well in terms of that durability, that quality, even within the scale. And then as we kind of move up and about, one of my favorite parts of the suit, even though I still have a soft spot for the original Rocksteady versions from Arkham Asylum and City in terms of that classic look, while at the same time still having a little bit of texture to give it a very delicate balance. Because they went a little all out with the mechanized feeling and vibe of the Arkham Knight suit, I kind of detached myself away from it from a design standpoint. But at least this kind of is pretty much a wet dream for toy makers because they can kind of really flex their muscles and their technique as far as how they are able to nail the sculpting of the chest and symbol area around the area here in the abdomens. And Kyoto Revoltech definitely flexed because you could see that they have an awful lot of the paneling, the chiseling, the sculpting, very well detailed. You could almost argue that this is both a flex metaphorically and literally here across the chest area, because you can see that much like in the game where he flexes his chest and he's able to kind of expand the panels here across the mesh to make it seem very feasible and flexible while at the same time kind of retaining its shape of the bat symbol. It's kind of happening as well here in toy form. Even at the 6-inch scale, you see a little bit of these panels separating here. Granted, they're mainly there to kind of support a little bit more of the shoulder articulation, but at the same time, I feel like a happy accident happened here where you're dealing with somewhat of an accurate look to the way that it looked like in Arkham Knight. So that's really good to see. And even more so as you kind of get around the collar area and you see all, like I said, the little bolts and rivets and all these things that kind of flex as he moves the neck about in the game. They managed to incorporate that here as well. The only part that gets kind of murky a little bit for me in terms of the armoring would have to be those shoulder pieces, because even though they're really painted and sculpted nice, especially when you get a little bit of that chrome kind of mechanized look towards the edges here. Frankly, I do feel like they're a little on the oversized area here as far as just how they look planted there on top of the shoulder. But at the same time, if I was to play devil's advocate, there's kind of a reason for why that is. And that is to mask and try to, I guess you could say, proportionalize the biceps, because this is a little bit where that Kyoto Revoltech style comes into play, that very exaggerated, over-stylized aesthetic to how they proportion their figures. Because if you squint hard enough, you'll notice that his biceps, and I guess to a further extent his thighs, just like with that original Spidey, they are massive, especially when he's kind of in this neutral pose and just straightforward like this, and or even at some points T-posing, in a matter of speaking. He just looks way too beefy in those areas, to the point where if you kind of either combine his biceps or his thighs, they're either just as big as his torso, and then one bicep alone is just as big as his head. And that is crazy, but again, that just kind of feeds into that exaggerated style that Kyoto or Revoltech often goes for. And at this point, you kind of have to accept it or not, especially when you start to then deal into posability and to those stances that you could put him in, to make a little bit of this exaggerated proportioning happening look a bit more in favor of the style, rather than to be it's almost like how you interpret art. Like there's certain artists out there like Pollock and etc. where they exaggerate proportions, but they do it on purpose because that's their style. They're not going for realism. Kyoto Revoltech is practically going for surrealism when it comes to proportions, even though they try their best to replicate an awful lot of the aesthetical look of whatever property they're pulling from, and in this case, Arkham Knight, which for the most part they do an adequate job. But I will say that one other area that kind of stands out just a tiny little bit in terms of having the accurate look to the stylized look that Revoltech goes for, and it kind of clashes in a not so complimentary way. It's not a terrible thing. It's a novel concept, but it then clashes to a way that could be divisive, would have to be the head sculpt, because even though they nailed the look and the molding and the sculpting of the brow, the way that the temples are kind of designed to favor that Arkham Knight helmet that's, like I said, mechanized and kind of clasps into him when he suits up. The ears, for my liking, are just a little too curved. They're supposed to be a little bit straighter and even a little taller. And then you kind of get to the mouth plate, which in my opinion just looks a little cartoony here, which is a lot to say considering how exaggerated it looks in game. But at least in game, it's got this texture. It kind of has this natural look that makes sense for the actual design they went for Batman / Bruce Wayne in Arkham Knight versus the way that he looked like in Arkham Asylum and Arkham City. He kind of got a little bit of a redesign, but at least it favored this much stockier physique that he had going on in that last game. Whereas here, because the proportions are so weird over here, and then this face, I feel like, I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger on it, but something needed to have been changed about the mouth plate because it just looks just a little off. But I'm open to admitting that that's more so on the subjective side. That's something that I just have within my gaze as something that feels a little off, maybe could have been done a little bit better. But I gotta be honest, guys, there's one major critical thing about this figure that I will have to point out and criticize rather objectively. It's something that is functionally getting in the way of really digging this figure and fully even loving it at some points. And that's got to be this cape. I'm sorry. It's this cape. I know that this is meant to be as a form of a revision or an answer to the people that had problems with that original cape that had all the panels, the joints within the panels, and made for some easy breaking of said panels or pegs, etc. So they opted to go for a fabric cloth cape that this time has a rather awesome looking pleather design to the outside here. I really do like the sheen and the pleathery look of the outside that really favors this leathery aesthetic, the way that it looked like in the game. It looks quality, even though, again, I know it's not leather, it's pleather, so they gotta have to cut back on costs. Otherwise, this thing probably would have been borderline $200. But at least it does the job of kind of creating that illusion of how well done of a cape it could have been. And make no mistake, the wiring that they got strung out throughout this entire thing, as well as the stitching and the way that it's kind of tailored here towards the bottom in terms of the curves, really does an immaculate job of looking like the cape when it's kind of in fully flexed winged out mode when you're gliding in the game. In fact, when you kind of stretch out the cape like this, it straight up looks like it's got pulled from the game. And I think the way that the pleather kind of creases in a positive way, again, it creates this style that I know Kyoto and Revoltech were probably going for and really favors their aesthetic, the tone that they're often going for. And granted, you don't really get much more pleather on the inside. You kind of get a little bit of a nylon effect as far as the surfacing of the texture inside. But that's okay because, like I said, they pleated it and stitched it very well on the outside. And again, the wiring is kind of crazy. It goes hard with this thing because you don't just get 2 wires on the outside. You get 3, no, what is it? 1, 2, wait, hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 total wires. Now, they're not the strongest wires. I do feel like they could have been a little sturdier, but they're sturdy just enough to where the fact that they went with 9 wires, you get that extra amount of support. And if you want to go crazy as far as posing with this cape, you can do so. And trust me, there's a couple of poses that I put him in to make it look like the cape is either blowing in the wind or it's looking like he's gliding midair like you do often in the game or your zipline, etc. And it looks badass in that regard. When you're trying to pose him in a much more neutral state, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. It is huge. It is a little overstitched and a little over-stylized and tailored to the point where it's going to be dragging a humongous amount and makes the guy just a little bit top-heavy. When I have this cape just dragging his literal feet from behind here, and you're trying to at least kind of fold it in the back to at least kind of mask it or hide it in some way, you see right there that it's just dragging, starts to rebound towards the front. I'm sorry, but this thing needed to be dialed down as far as length. It really is the length because I understand the idea that they were going for. And trust me, I was a little bit more sour when I first pulled him out of the box, but after marinating on it a little bit, I softened up, but my criticisms still stand as far as the length. Sometimes, going longer and bigger is not always better. Sometimes the inches do in fact matter. How many euphemisms can I sneak in here? Well, you're going to be praying for some more euphemisms before I get to my next major criticism that I was just left utterly perplexed. Still kind of sticking with the cape and the problems that it's presenting. Why in the hell did Revoltech, Amazing Yamaguchi, decide, whose decision was it, to attach the cape to the underside of the shoulder guards? If you notice right here carefully, the cape is actually coming from underneath the shoulder guards, so it's kind of vying through the collar piece, which makes sense. You kind of expect it to kind of come from behind over here beyond the flexible collar piece, which actually can move about to allow a little bit more of posability and maneuverability of the wires that are coming from the center part right here. So this entire collar piece right here that is very intricately designed and kind of favors the design look, the armorized look of the top of the cowl here and the collar that's circumventing it. It moves about in its place to allow a little bit more flexibility. But when you kind of look into the outside wires here, you'll notice that they stitched the wires, the outside ones, into the shoulder guard from underneath, and then it comes out near the bicep area. So it's attached to the shoulder and the arm as a whole. Why? And I know that that's more so a rhetorical question because, frankly, this is probably the perfect way to segue into articulation. Because having this happen right here, again, it just kind of feeds into the problem that I was having where I'm trying to hide this thing towards the back, but naturally it's attached to this part of the shoulder guard, and therefore it's going to stay there. Whereas what if I wanted to kind of flex it more so towards the back? Maybe I want the cape to kind of droop over the shoulder guard. Maybe I want to give him that classic Keaton look where he's got the cape kind of flexing towards the front and he's kind of perched up top and he's folding the cape onto himself, kind of like a coat or something. But you frankly really can't do that with this guy right here because of the wires being kind of pressed and almost glued and stitched on the inside part. So the point where I think somebody online, I think I saved it, I might be wrong, it was on Mercari. They were selling their own Amazing Yamaguchi Arkham Knight Batman, but they were selling it at a humongous discount. I was wondering why. Turns out the reason why is because they broke this shoulder guard here. And my theory is that they did so by trying to move the cape out, and they broke this piece off because the cape is now glued and placed underneath the shoulder guard. And I have absolutely no idea why it is that Revoltech opted for this option here. And the reason for why this could create a little bit of problems later down the line is when you do get into the posability. You see, in traditional Amazing Yamaguchi style, the head is a little bit conflicted because it feels like it can turn 360, and typically on characters like Spider-Man, where it's just an oval head, it can do so. But here, because of the way that the helmet and the cowl is sculpted, it kind of feels like it stops right about right there. It feels like maybe I could press it a little further, but I really don't feel like testing my luck. But it can make almost like a full 180 turn from left to right, so at least that's good to see. And what's even better to see is just how flexible it is to tilt up and down. You see right there, that's being able to look almost completely all the way up in an almost unnatural sort of way, and then look down on the top peg. But if you want to look down even a little further, you'll notice that you technically also have some articulation at the base of the neck, top of the chest, that allows a little bit more flexibility of this entire armorized collar piece right here. So not only does it make it look like a little bit of the pieces of the armor are kind of flexing and look a little lifelike, but you even get some additional articulation to favor certain ways that you want him to look in certain directions that you want to be able to pose the head in at. So that's pretty cool. But when we get to shoulders, again, that's where my problem with this whole contraption of having the cape be stitched underneath the shoulder guard is a bit problematic, because typically here is where I say that you should be able to rotate the arms no problem, but you really do have a problem in the form of that cape. He can only really lift his arms, I want to say, about that far, which is pretty good. You know, I'm not going to take away from the fact that this is at least a fair amount of distance, but you know me. I want my figures to still have the function to rotate 360. It's an action figure. Here, at least you're able to technically move the arm about that high up, but it technically stops right about right there, of course, because of the way that the cape is then buried underneath the shoulder guard. A similar case could be made about flexing it in the opposite direction, where it goes about, I want to say maybe about that far, before you see that the cape is now moving in tandem with it. So if you wanted to move the arms without ever touching the cape, that's practically not going to happen, really. And I know the rhetorical answer for why that is because when you do arm extension of any kind, the arm extension is actually pretty dope. You can extend almost beyond the 180 degree. So if you ever want to pose them in that gliding position, the cape is pretty much going to extend naturally into said position to the point where you get that impressive wingspan, like Ham said in Toy Story. But when, again, I still don't like that. That's kind of forced upon you, and I just wish that they would have taken that out personally. But at least we can kind of look at the positive side of things with that butterfly joint. Again, going back to this panel that is not just there for show to make it look like it's mechanized, the mechanized part of the chest. It technically is also another butterfly joint that allows the shoulder to be able to flex forward about that far, and a little towards the back about that far right there. Kind of similar, not too unlike like the one that Spider-Man had on that armorized Mark II 2.0, I think it was, the new reissue that I recently covered from Revoltech that had a similar joint and similar paneling happening here, except I would argue it looks a bit more natural on Batman because that's naturally where these pieces flexed in-game, so that's pretty cool to see. And then there is a bicep swivel, except it can only kind of move in certain directions, only about that far, but that's only because of how massive and girthy those biceps really are. So you can see right there that they kind of nudge from side to side, but they really don't go too far, especially if, once again, you have the wiring of the cape kind of getting in the way, so it becomes a little conflicted. You have a ball joint at the elbow that allows flexing and bending at a little bit of a, I want to say 100 degree. It's a little bit past the 90 degree, but it only flexes about that far, so it's not double jointed like some other manufacturers like to do, like McFarlane, etc. But you technically also have a little bit of swiveling at the top of said ball joint that allows the forearm to kind of move in this direction right here and kind of create a little bit of a suggestive gesture. So I highly do not recommend that, but at least there is a little bit of movement there. And then of course the wrist ball joints right there that allow the hand to fully rotate 360 as well as bend inwards and outwards pretty flexibly. In fact, considering how massive the gauntlets really are, there's actually not that much of a restriction when it comes to movement of the wrists. Now, I'll admit that the torso is actually kind of cool because you do get a mid-torso cut that allows movement side to side. Not a full 360 rotation, but it does feel pretty good in hand in terms of how far you can really push it. And there is some really good crunching and extending towards the front and back. I would argue that maybe the crunching is probably the best part as far as the front, and pretty decent towards the back. But then if you want to get a little further to extend towards the back and favor, again, some of those gliding or flying down poses, you rely more so on the waist cut that allows it to flex a little bit. There's a bit of gappage happening between the belt and that waist cut piece right inside there, but not as abrasive as some other figures have actually come to be known by. But flexing forwards and crunching forwards on the waist can also be done right about right there, and even a little bit side to side. And actually, I would say that you can technically kind of flex a little bit of the belt side to side. It's almost as far as that of the mid-torso, so no real 360 movement. But at the same time, I would argue that in this case, you wouldn't want them to, because they opted for a function with the belt that to this day, even after a few days of marinating with this figure, I don't necessarily know how to feel about it, because they opted for this belt where it's kind of broken up here in the middle part to where you have the center buckle piece kind of molded into the plastic of the diaper or the crotch piece. And then you have these side pieces right here. They're broken away. On purpose, so this isn't like a defect or anything like that. They're broken away, and they move about on a peg towards the back. And they're meant there to kind of flex and move out of the way. So when you kind of move a little bit of the waist joint, they are going to be moving just a little bit more so. But the main primary focus as to why they built and designed the belt in this manner is for the top leg joint, so that when you do move these leg joints, these pieces kind of flex and move out of the way without ever compromising the sculpting of the plastic, and you don't risk warping the plastic and breaking it away officially, by accident, unintentionally. The only downside, though, is that sometimes, like I said, it looks a little bit unnatural when I do move the top leg joints, and that is considering if you do get functional and non-squeaky and non-problematic top leg joints like mine. Yeah, I'm starting to think that this is like a manufacturing thing when it comes to toy companies based in Japan. Maybe they're all using the same manufacturer in terms of mass production that is stationed over there, whether it be in Japan or just somewhere in the East like China. I don't know. I don't exactly know, but I'm starting to see a reoccurring trend here. Because first it was figure arts with those Toby figures, and the Toby figure that I got in particular from No Way Home, where he's got one of the squeaky arms, and it was risking breaking if I didn't fix it with like some soapy water, etc. And I kind of tackled that same method when it came to the Mayfix, Carnage, and Venom reissues that also had squeaky joints that were starting to stick and risk breaking and scaring me. And now it's happening again, this time with Revoltech, because here we have two joints at the top of the legs that can flex a good amount towards the front, about that far, like so, and that's how they're supposed to be. And then flexing towards the back is pretty modest, except the diaper piece does kind of come into contact and allows a little bit of gappage to happen right there at the top. But extending towards the sides is actually pretty dope. It almost reaches a full 90-degree angle. That's how the joint is supposed to be, and for now, we're kind of in the clear, except this joint that I'm moving, when I first pulled it out of the box, it was squeaking like a bitch. that was a phrase. But seriously, it was, in fact, this one is starting, this one is starting to squeak and get a little sticky on me, and ever so often I have to pass it with the hairdryer, or simply just take some soapy water and just kind of dribble a little bit of it inside of the joint. So I was able to fix this one, but now this one is starting to kind of contract the same, they're catching the same flu here, so to speak, being neighbors to each other. And therefore now this one is starting to get a little squeaky on me. You can almost even kind of hear it kind of going into the mic right now, despite how much post-processing I put into this audio. That's how loud it is. Yeah. And it scares me because that's not the only joint. We'll get to that momentarily, but right below it you do have, I guess you could argue, a thigh swivel. It's kind of like an upper thigh swivel that is designed in a little bit of an angle, so when you kind of swivel it, it's not going to do like an even 180 swivel. It's more so like at an angle, so you could kind of see it right there. It's kind of flexing off towards the sides, but it does allow a little bit of flexibility when it comes to certain poses and getting his balance and his footing down right. And then we get to the knees, where you only have really one joint. Again, kind of surprising considering how they try to like favor style and things like that. But I kind of discovered this with the amazing Yamaguchi Revoltech 2.0 reissue of Spidey with the mech armor. And so here we have a similar joint, and it bends simply all the way, almost all the way up like so. So it flushes in pretty naturally. They kind of cut out the inside part of the thigh to make sure that it flexes up naturally like that. And it looks pretty natural and pretty smooth and fluid. Except the one on my right, and the reason why I'm taking a deep breath, as you can hear it, that one's sticky as well. And that one I've already poured, it was even worse, to the point where there were certain instances it wouldn't legitimately move. Passed it with the hairdryer at high speed, high power, gave it some soapy water and dripped it in there as much as possible. I haven't tried the boiling water yet, but that's only because this is such a high tier figure that I really don't want to risk that. I'm trying to be as delicate and exacting as possible. And for a little while, it looked like it fixed it. The squeaking was gone for a little while, but I guess after some time, especially with cold temperatures here in SoCal, I guess it kind of got a little restuck. And you can hear it's starting to squeak again. So the mobility is still there to flex all the way up, but it comes at the cost of being very robust and squeaky to where I really don't want to press my luck of doing it so many times. So I'm going to leave that joint as static as possible. And before I forget, just under the knee, you actually have a bit of a joint. It's a very awkward joint because it doesn't really swivel, but it sort of nudges the shin and the calf side to side and up and down. It's very strange. I really can't pinpoint exactly what kind of joint this is, but there's a little bit of added flexibility here if you want some better stability for his posing, especially when you find yourself in a bit of a tough spot with that cape. You can at least rely on some of these calf joints to help you out. And then when you get down to these ankles where you do have these pieces that kind of flex forwards, you do at least have a little bit of mobility on the ankle joint to allow the foot to kind of pivot upwards and downwards, but not as much as you like. But the only reason for why it's a little fidgety is because you kind of have to do a little bit of trial and error with the ankle joint, to where you kind of have to like flex it towards the back and then press up, or flex it towards the front and press down to get the foot to go all the way down like so. So you kind of have to toy around with it a little bit. So it's a little bit on the sensitive side, but it is a ball joint nonetheless. And technically that panel just came off. But when you do so, it does allow the ankle to rotate 360 in place, because it is, after all, a ball joint. You're just going to have to play around with it a little bit, but at the expense of this panel coming off. But thankfully, it's just a ball joint. You can just pop it back in and you're good to go again. And right below that, you'll notice that you do have toes that kind of flex towards the top and are actually pretty fluid and pretty well articulated. So if you want a little bit of that styling and posing, and if you want to go even a little further, much like with Spidey, those toes can actually flex. I keep forgetting about this. The toes can technically flex downwards as well in a very unnatural sort of way. So if you want to make it look like, Batman is, enjoying himself a little bit too much, us guys, we know what we're talking about, right? Those toes can go down like so, like that. But at least the mobility of those toes and the footing, it kind of complements a little bit of the style. And that's the thing, again, with Revoltech, is that when you get style in very exaggerated proportions such as this, I understand that the joints that they, in a very curated sort of way, they designed into the figure itself, not just for Arkham Knight Batman here, but also with like Spidey and some of the other characters that they've tackled. They're often favoring that exaggerated style. So often these characters are not supposed to be in a neutral position, because that's going to make these proportions stand out like a sore thumb. Once you get this guy kind of rolling in certain stylized poses, whether it be in, like I said, the gliding pose to make the cape look a little bit more natural, or make it look like he's doing like a high diving kick like he does in the games, then the articulation really does stand out and does make him look badass. So say if I wanted to at least bend one of the knees and make it look like he's, dodging an attack or something, then that's where we start to kind of breathe a little bit of life into the figure, and it definitely complements the overall illusion of the Arkham Knight Batman here. And that's exactly where you do get your money's worth. It just becomes a little bit of a journey that at this point you kind of have to subscribe to, in a matter of speaking. But Revoltech is also not that much of a stranger of allowing maybe some of the accessories to complement the character and the figure, just as much as the stylized nature of the articulation is, as well as also certain attributions like the cape and things like that. Except, personally, I feel like I was expecting just a little bit more with the Arkham Knight interpretation, because with Spidey, okay, you can only throw in so many hands, so many web accessories. Characters like that are a little bit more on self-reliance, so to speak, in speaking to their character. Batman is known to have an arsenal of accessories. So when I saw that you have this rack, for example, that's meant to hold his hands, and then he only really comes with 5 additional hands on top of the default fists that he comes with out of the box, I gotta be honest, I was a little disappointed, just a little bit. But that was before I started to toy around with the other accessories that we're about to get to here in the moment. But for now, just know that on top of these hands, he does come with 2 extending hands that probably complement the gliding position a little bit more. They're kind of extending to make it look like maybe he's flying mid-air. So they are there and well sculpted and painted with a little bit of the silver knuckles there, as well as the glove kind of aesthetic to have a little bit of that cushiony paneling with the blue and the black happening there. And then 2 holding hands. I'm going to call them that because there's actually a number of things that he could technically be holding with said hands. So those are also sported there. And I guess jumping the gun a little bit upon this rack is going to be this single right hand that has the zip liner sculpted directly into the hand itself. So kind of similar to, I would almost argue maybe Mezco. I remember the last company that I saw something like this. It was Mezco with the Batman, the Pattinson Batman, where they sculpted the batarangs directly into some of the hands. So you have extra hands, but just to have the batarangs look as natural as possible inside of those hands. Revoltech kind of did a similar thing here with the zip liner, where you don't get a zip line accessory. You simply just get it kind of sculpted and glued on completely to the secondary right hand. And so I guess you don't really have to worry about fitting it into the hand because it is part of it. And it's decently painted and sculpted with the chrome and the black, and you actually have a little bit of weathering to make it look like a legitimate gadget. Except the only real functionality of the zipline in this position, in this way, is to simply just remove this top piece here, and you'll notice that you have a tab that fits into the slot. So when you pull it apart, you remove pretty much the 2 pieces that are designed to kind of launch the grapple and launch the zipline. The reason for why this is removable is because then he comes with the added piece that is sculpted similarly here in the middle to then place inside of the zipline. But now you'll notice that one end has the legit grapple and the wire kind of sticking out of it. So you have that right there, and it's designed to make it look like it's launching the grapple. Here's where things get just a little confusing, is because on the side they also tossed in this separate piece that you're supposed to kind of assemble in a very specific way. It's kind of sculpted here. The hole is cut out in a very designated way to where you can only place it like this, kind of flexed this way. So everything assembled together is supposed to look like that. And I'm like, okay, cool. You got the zip line, you got the grapples that are designed to hold onto the walls that he's ziplining to on either end. And when you have him suspended in the air, it looks legitimately like he's going down a zipline like he is in the game. Awesome. So you do have that functionality there, but spoilers, there's no grapple. There's no grapple gun, especially when you take into account how the grapplers here at the end of the zipline look like. It makes you wonder exactly, well, where's the zipliner? Like, there's legitimately no zipline grapple hook gun of any sort, and that's one of the more iconic gadgets that Batman had in the entirety of the Arkham series. Now, along with that grapple hook, you could argue that the next most iconic gadget is, of course, going to be a batarang, and you technically have that right there, sculpted just like it is in the Arkhamverse with the wings, the way that the holes are kind of perforated there in the middle, the little design in the center, and overall it looks pretty nice, pretty well sculpted, not much in terms of paint. If you're looking for additional paint, look for the secondary batarang that they also tossed in, which is going to be the sonar batarang or the remote control batarang that looks pretty identical to the standard one, except you of course got the little symbol there in the middle that is a little thicker with a added little blue paint there in the center to kind of make it look a little marbleized and kind of indicative that this is in fact the sonar remote controlled one that has electronics built into it. So you do have that. And so you get extra batarangs. Still no grapple hook. Still no explosive gel gun. Nothing like that. Okay, so what else do we have to work with here? Well, you get not one, but 2 decrypting sequencers or sequence decryptors. I can't remember what the official term is called. But you get two, not just one, but two. And the reason for why you get two is because one is meant to look like it's clasped and kind of not working in a very default, non-functioning sort of way. And then the other one is the one that's deployed to make it look like he's actually using it when trying to open up a locked door. So kind of like the way that he extends it in the game and kind of pulls it apart like this. That's basically the second one. And both are painted. I'm sorry, they're not even painted. They're really not much in terms of paint decal, but they do have a little bit of sculpting and etching to give it a little bit of detail. But the decrypting sequencers, they really don't have much going on by themselves. I have to specifically say by themselves, because there is a little bit of a cool and pretty sick gimmick happening with the sequencers that I will have to admit to. And that is that each of these sequencers have a little hole perforated there in the center. And so when you take this little, I guess you could call it an adapter, and fit the peg into the adapter on one end. On the other end, you have like this section here that has a bit of a very thin cutout. And that cutout is for you to place one of the 5 little translucent plates here to replicate the holographic imagery that comes out of the sequencer to make it look like he is either scanning the environment, looking for some kind of trail, or more importantly, he's trying to crack a password of some kind to break open a door or a safe or a computer terminal, etc. So when you place one of the panels inside, it looks like this. And I gotta be honest, this is a pretty cool effect. I really dig it. My personal favorite is the one that says password accepted, because a lot of us were trying to get to those goddamn Riddler trophies, and we knew that we needed to do this a number of times. So that is a very novel concept. I really enjoy it. The panels themselves are really well done as far as the glossy nature to them once you peel back a little bit of the protective film. But then you see that each one of them is designed differently. You have the password accepted. You have one about the caution, like the environment, one that says, that lets you know how far you are from your main point. I think one of them is telling you about the interference out of range. So it kind of tells you the meters you have to travel, etc. So that's awesome. With that said, again, I love this concept. I really do dig it. Why did we need 2 decryptors? Why decrypting sequencers, whatever you want to call them? Why did we need 2? This effect is cool, but we know that this effect happens when he deploys the open one. Why did we need the closed one? Why did we need 2 batarangs, even if one of them comes with the additional detail? And the zipliner, why do we need the extra, like, I don't know what it is, but I still feel like we were kind of a little short-handed, both figuratively and literally, because I still feel like we could have added an extra set of hands of some kind with different gestures, or at least one other gadget. And among them, I would probably nominate the grapple hook gun, as that sole accessory that is completely missing here. And to be honest, I'm completely out of the loop as to why it is that it wasn't included. What was included, of course, is the traditional translucent base that Revoltech often likes to throw in, which is pretty cool because it's got all these perforations where you can move the arm in a variety of ways, and it's fully posable. It's got the clasp right here, but it's generic. It doesn't really have any kind of decorative, thematic details and paints on it to make it look like it's tied to Arkham Knight Batman here. But that's really about it for the default version of Arkham Knight Batman from Revoltech. However, I didn't get the default version. Oh no, I went a little extra. I pre-ordered with Hobby Genki, and those folks were actually generous enough to toss in a bonus faceplate. You heard that right, faceplate. One of the biggest additions to this Revoltech Batman, Arkham Knight Revoltech Batman, that I was kind of saving for last because it's actually one of the more impressive things about finding in a figure of the scale is the ability to swap out the faceplates and actually remove the front of the head there. And officially, you can do so without the need for an extra faceplate, but I wanted to kind of combine these 2 features towards the end here, because on the side, you also get this included piece right here with the little hook. And the reason for why that is not only to swap out the faceplates for the bonus grimace face that he's got going on right here with the aggressive, more style to his expression right there, with showing the teeth, looking like he's in pain, or he's kind of like delivering a punch. So at least we have the functionality, the ability to be able to swap out features and kind of, again, favoring the expression, favoring the style, and making sure that it looks very dynamic mid-pose, whether it be him kicking a bad guy, throwing a punch, ziplining, gliding down, etc. That's cool. However, if you flip the faceplate, you'll notice that, yeah, you can see right there, he does in fact come with rolling eyeballs. And that's what this tool is for, not just to pry the faceplates off to be able to swap them a little easier, but you can technically move the eyeballs with this little hook, pressing it into the white piecing here with the little crevice inside, and that's how you're able to get the balls to roll. As far as the eyeballs, now those specific balls, those are the ones that you're going to be rolling around. So, and therefore that just adds a whole new flavor to changing up the expressions, adding to the style. And I gotta be honest, this is probably a very sick concept that I would love more companies to be able to do. Now, it's not perfect. In fact, you're gonna be running into an awful lot of trial and error trying to get the eyes to be in a very specific pose or direction with either of the faceplates. One is not easier than the other, whether it be the neutral one or the grimace one. I gotta be honest, the idea is incredibly awesome, but the actual execution could be a little bit better, but I can tell that they're trying. I can tell that this is something that is probably still in a somewhat preliminary stage, but I would argue that maybe a fix, I don't know the exact fix, but I would argue that maybe what they need to do, see, I got mine a little bit cross-eyed there with the grimace face, but I think that the thing they need to look into is to kind of change up the materials, because I feel like plastic on plastic, because it looks like the eyeballs are also made out of the same plastic that the rest of the faceplate is made out of. So I think in that regard, it's causing a little bit of friction, and that friction is not doing favors when it comes to trying to give the eyeballs a press with this piece, that sometimes you end up going a little bit too far. You have to like know your own strength. That's why moving any of the eyeballs for either of the faceplates, the default one or the secondary one, that's again a bit of a bonus. So it really depends on where you pre-ordered, if it gets included, or you might just get the standard version that just comes with the figure by itself. But nevertheless, this function is in fact the neutral one as well. But just know that you're going to be kind of sitting for a good minute to try to get these eyes to look in a very specific pose. Now, granted, you may get the same thing happening to you like it happened to me, which was a very happy accident, where I accidentally pressed the eyes in a direction so far that his eyes went completely white, Undertaker style. But to be honest, for the character of Batman, it actually ended up going kind of hard, so it really depends on you. So you might get an end result like that, or in my case, like I said, you're just going to have to sit and kind of play around with it enough times to get the plastic to go beyond the point of friction and actually move in your favor, so that if you want them to look to the left or look to the right, it'll do so. But at least the novel concept is there, and it's all cool and dandy, and it's probably one of the areas that you look at a company like Kyoto and Revoltech and think to yourself, yeah, if there was a company out there that would do something as that, it will most definitely be this one. But you know I have to do this. We have to, of course, toss in good old reliable Arkham Knight Batman from McFarlane Toys, just to see exactly how we kind of notice the differences between style and interpretation and kind of subversion versus simplicity and functionality, and maybe even affordability to boot. Because you see right here what you get for roughly somewhere between $100 to $120, depending on how you ordered it, if you imported, if you got it from in-state seller like Entertainment Earth or Big Bad Toy Store, or getting something that at one point was available through simply just getting it off of the store shelves at your local Target or Walmart. Now, you may argue, I know that some of you are probably pinpointing right now exactly how much of a struggle I'm going through to balance him out, because this is one of the areas that I will criticize McFarlane, is that sometimes they're very top-heavy figures, like Arkham Knight here, for example, is a little testy when it comes to balancing. I have to sometimes rely a little bit on that cape. But once you get them in a very stable pose here, even if the feet don't really flush, and I'm kind of, like I said, relying on the cape a little bit here, you see exactly that sometimes style over substance, it really does boil it down to preference, because this guy's got so many features, got so many things going for it, as far as, you know, the very peculiar ideas that Revoltech had up their sleeve, whether it be with the rolling eyeball system within their faceplates, the cool holographic design to the panels that you can kind of put on the the decrypting sequencer, and then the zip line to kind of interpret the different ways that it's kind of throwing that zip line. And there goes Arkham Knight Batman again. But then you look at the McFarlane and think to yourself, you know what that one's got going for it? The proportions. This legitimately looks, in terms of physique and proportion, directly lifted from the Arkham Knight video game. Sure, the Revoltech's got that really clean sheen and aesthetic to the paint decals as far as getting the armor right, getting the blue a little bit more accurate, the gold plating, etc. As far as the chrome aesthetics to the spikes, the gauntlets, the knuckles on the wrists right there on the hands, as well as the shoulder pieces. Sure, way more detail, way more effort put into that. But then you're dealing with all those styles that look a little unnatural when he's in a very neutral pose, and the only way to make them look a little bit more flush to the aesthetic is to put him in a dynamic pose. Static over here, and yet you're dealing with a physique that looks more one-to-one accurate, and you know what the McFarlane's got? The explosive gel gun, which is not found in the Revoltech. I'm sorry, it's not found there. He does come with his own rather enlarged batarang, but then he's also got the zipline launcher. I can't remember exactly what this gun was, to be quite honest. I believe this is like the super industrialized grapple hook gun. It's not the maneuver, the easy one to zipline through Arkham, through the city, but at the same time, this is one of those much more elongated gadgets that can't really be found here, and it's probably the closest to a grapple gun that we're gonna come with. It's not the exact grapple gun, but it's probably the closest thing that we're gonna get to as far as a grapple gun within either of these guys. And guess what? He comes with a McFarlane. So yeah, that's the thing, is that sometimes simplicity is the way to go and affordability, but at the same time, there is an argument to be made for the Revoltech in this specific regard, and it's a really worthwhile effort. I just think that there's still some criticisms to be brought forward that makes the price point of like roughly between $110 to almost $130 just a little steep, but I can see it. It's not lost on me. It's not like I look at the price and go, I don't know what you guys are doing, throwing in superfluous gadgets, except for a couple of the duplicates like the sequencer, the batarang, because I can think of other ways that they probably could have gone in terms of those accessories, but at least I know that Revoltech is still aiming to do what they do best, which is just their own territory of style, of exaggerated proportions, but going for something dynamic and cool and very niche to them. And for having a Batman from Revoltech, Arkham Knight Batman is definitely doing the job for now, but I still can't help but vie for some kind of definitive comic Batman that is more so on along the lines of a 2.0 revision from that original version that came with those paneled capes and such. Kind of like the way that they did with Spidey. I want them still to do that with Batman. Effectively, it manages to secure a 7 out of 10, primarily because I was leaning towards giving it even a lower rating considering how much of the figure was just downright falling apart on me with either the ankle pieces, as you saw right there, where I was trying to move him about and trying to get the ankle articulation rotating, as well as some of the shoulder pieces even start to fall off, the cumbersome nature of the cape. But then when you get it in a very, very stylized pose as far as getting really dynamic with it, that's where Amazing Yamaguchi hits its strengths at kind of anchoring towards that niche demographic of going for style over something much more definitive. If you want to put him in a much more neutral position, you're probably going to have to look at the LPZZ figure that's coming up here, or if you want something a bit more on the budget-friendly side, then go into the aftermarket for that McFarlane DC Multiverse figure. Or if you want to go to the other side of the extreme spectrum, you can then fork over an even $250 to sometimes even $400 in the aftermarket and get the higher quality but super pricey 1/6 scale Hot Toys figure for the Arkham Knight Batman, of which I actually happen to have in my possession. So if you guys want to see that review, let me know down in the comment section below, and while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, take care and stay humble. I'll see you guys next time.